Michelle Marie McGrath.
Welcome to Unclassified Woman, and today I've got a very special guest, Kelly Surtees. Kelly is a consulting astrologer, teacher, writer and editor who works with clients and students around the world. With more than 14 years in private practice, Kelly is experienced, warm and insightful. She loves exploring astrology's history as well as escaping into the ocean. Kelly's passion for astrology is infectious, and her specialty areas include career and life direction, health and fertility, love, health and happiness. She can be found meeting clients and lecturing at conferences throughout the US, Canada and Australia. Kelly holds the Australian FAA Practitioner's Diploma and is an expat Aussie who now lives in Canada most of the year. You can find out more about her work at kellysastrology.com. Now, I was so excited to speak to Kelly, another fellow Piscean, because I'd long been interested in the possibility of looking at your astrological chart and whether or not it's immediately apparent whether or not you're going to A, not have children or have difficulty having children, and what the different indications are around this whole topic. So I was really looking forward to hearing about Kelly's perspective and her choice not to have children, as well as from her astrological experience. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation. So welcome, Kelly. So great to have you here today. Dying to have our conversation about this topic.
Thanks, Michelle. It's fantastic to be connecting with you. It's been quite a few years now, and it's lovely to have seen how you've flourished over the last few years, and really excited to talk about such a heartfelt topic with you today.
Well, I've been meaning to contact you to talk about some of these astrological influences on this topic, as well as your personal experience, of course. And so I think this is going to be so interesting for the listeners as well. I'm really excited to get into it. So just to give us a bit of context, Kelly, could you please share with us a little bit about your background and whether you've not had a child due to it being circumstantial or whether it's been a very conscious choice of yours?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely a conscious choice, and it was a choice that I made relatively young, I guess, very early in my 20s. And it wasn't a choice that I made for all these logical or rational reasons. It was just a choice that reflected my feelings. I grew up in a very large family, so I'm the eldest of 6 kids. And I, through various things in our childhood, including my mum passing away and, dad remarrying and being the eldest, I was a little bit more maybe involved or participating in the process of helping out with my younger siblings. So I felt like I did a lot more in childhood maybe than what someone might typically do. And just my own feelings from those experiences were that I have a very, very close bond with my siblings. And I guess in some ways I've always felt like they are my children. And it's such a weird thing to say and even think. And so from a very young age in my early 20s, I just was not interested in having my own kids and was always very, very excited to be an auntie. And I think part of that too comes from having 2 really great childless role models. My dad's 2 sisters, my 2 aunts, were really instrumental in helping raise us after our mum passed away for those first couple of years. And they were 2 very important women in my life, and neither of them, through their own choices and circumstances, had children. And so for me growing up, it was not a weird or an unusual thing, I don't think, to not want to have children. For me, inside myself, I'm sure, my siblings and my parents, they love it if I did have kids, but for me personally, it was just like, no, I don't think that's what I'll do.
Wow, so that's great that you had those strong female role models who were showing you that possibility then so close to you.
Yeah, I do. It wasn't, as I said, a conscious thing. But in hindsight, when I look back at it, I think, wow, yeah, I did have some really amazing role. I mean, I have an amazing stepmom too, who did a whole lot of mothering, for her own children and for her stepchildren. But yeah, my aunts, I do see them as, I guess, great role models of how involved a woman can be in the life of children when they're not biologically hers.
Great. Well, that's a really positive experience of seeing that, because so many women don't have that experience at all, because
Sure.
everyone around them is really in that traditional pattern of, this is just what you do, you follow the script. And so
Yeah.
that's fantastic that you could see that that was a possibility for you. It was something that was very tangible. So
Yeah.
great.
And and I'm sure like mum and dad, or certainly my dad and my parents, are very big on family. So, but it's kind of weird that there were those role models, if not explicitly, but certainly in the way they lived their life, I guess, that there were other options.
And so, did you ever feel any pressure at all from your own friends and family? I mean, I guess if you were already one of 6 siblings, then I'm assuming that some of them would have had children as well. So that may have taken off the pressure slightly, but
a little bit. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm the eldest of the 6. So and my brother, actually, only one of my siblings has had children so far, because they are all, some of them are still in their 20s. They're a little
Right.
younger. But one of them has now had a child, and it is the golden grandchild, first grandchild on both sides of the family. And we're all doting aunts and uncles and grandparents. So that has definitely sort of shifted the focus. But I didn't really feel a lot of that pressure. I think maybe I had made my point of view kind of known from such a young age. And for a period in my late 20s, I was in a relationship with someone who didn't want to have children, which suited me fine, because I didn't want to either. And then, I've since moved on from that relationship. I married a beautiful man, and he has got 2 children from his first marriage. So I've sort of followed into my part of my own experience with family in that stepmothering role. And not a lot of pressure at all in my 20s. Once we got into our 30s, a little bit more pressure, mostly from some friends that are a little bit older than me. So women who would have been in their kind of mid to late 30s while I was still in my early 30s. And, and they're having families and really loving it, and just sort of saying, you have to do it, you have to do it. And I was sort of like, no, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to change my mind, but, I'll reserve the right to change my mind. So, I don't know whether just some of my life choices are a bit unconventional anyway, that not having children, perhaps people sort of see that as an unconventional choice going along with doing things like being an astrologer.
yeah. And so, well, there you go. And that's a perfect example, of somebody who is using their mothering and nurturing abilities with other children in their lives that are not their biological children. And so you are still using those like qualities of, being caring and compassionate and caretaking in a way, in a loving way, but that not needing, for that to be your own child that you've given birth to.
Yeah. And I mean, you obviously know a lot more about this topic and about different women's experiences here, but I think there is a really important place or role for women who are childless, whether you're childless by choice, and I understand the heartbreak when you're childless not through your own choice. When I read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Committed, have you read that book, Michelle?
Yes, I have.
Yeah,
Yes.
I reread the little section where she talks about her decision around being childless.
Yeah.
And that really kind of summarized for me the important role that childless women play, because if you kind of buy into that, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Well, part of the people in that village are women who haven't had children themselves.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And we are really this rapidly growing demographic, because now I know that women age 40 and over, make up about 25% of the female population worldwide. And that figure has doubled in the last 10 years. And it's only going to increase more rapidly and more dramatically moving forward as many more people are actually consciously questioning their motivations for having a child and really weighing up the reality of that in their lives and looking at whether or not that fits in or whether they can afford it, looking at environmental implications as well. So there's just so many aspects to consider, and people are starting to really look at that much more closely. Whereas, of course, in our parents' and grandparents' generation, again, it was the thing that you did, and you didn't necessarily question that so much. But now, of course, we are faced with all of these different choices and options as women that, again, you don't need to get married, and you don't need to be supported by a man. I say that in inverted commas. So you don't need to have children. There's, many paths to fulfillment, as we know. And so I think it's great that we're having more of these conversations and looking at this and looking at how we are shifting, sociologically, and just looking at women are much more conscious now of looking at what is it that brings me purpose? What is it that brings me fulfillment? What am I here for? And obviously that's different for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the raising children part is a incredibly consuming path.
Yeah.
And I think maybe because I come at it from that astrological perspective, which is hugely spiritual and very much about that perspective of the individual soul and what do you need to evolve and to grow in this lifetime. And we don't all get every experience, not because some of us are better than others, but because each of us are unique, and that we each require different experiences and different circumstances so we can really grow. And I don't mean grow in that, Hollywood, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, hoo-ha way, which just makes me shrivel on the inside. But we need to grow in those kind of spiritually and soulfully meaningful ways. And for some people, that is absolutely having children. But I think for a lot of people, it's not. And one of the biggest struggles, I think, women who do have children struggle with is how to do all those other things in the mess of raising children, which is something when you don't have the children factor that you can almost get on with the other stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, although having said that, I know some of my friends who've got children who, oh my God, I don't know how they manage to fit in, running businesses and all sorts. But I think a lot of that, it's like anything, it comes down to often the individual's personality and what's driving them and what their, motivating principles are and all of that. So it's just so varied. And like you say, each soul has its own individual path and the things that are going to bring it the most growth. And so that's the beauty, isn't it, of having astrology as a tool. Like, you've got that overview and you've got that perspective that can give you a bit of a roadmap, I guess, in, clues of what to look for, what challenges matter, and what can help you. And rather than working against the energy that's there, like trying to work with it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And one of the things that came up when I was just reviewing a few points for our conversation today, I revisited Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Committed. And there's one interesting statistic where she talks about that if you look across human populations of all varieties in every culture and on every continent, you will find that there is a consistent 10% of women within any population who never have children at all.
And it's more than that now.
Yeah, and she says, she says the percentage never gets any lower than that ever anywhere. But in fact, the percentage of women who never reproduce in most societies is usually much higher than 10%.
Yeah,
and not just in the Western developed world, where it can be as high as 50%.
Well, it is in the States. So nearly 50% of women of a childbearing age in the USA don't have children. And if you think about that, you think that is nearly half of the female that is
it's
huge.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal when you think about what kind of mainstream pop culture pushes out as the ideal woman. And it's really only speaking to the desires or the realities of half the female population, as you say, because the other half that don't have children maybe they just haven't got to the point where they want to have it. But certainly, as you said, with the age factor, I mean, once you kick in over 40, whether you want it or not, it starts to become less of a viable option.
Yeah.
And then there are these huge amounts of women that's just not what their life looks like, I guess.
Absolutely. And also, you know, people are getting married older as well.
Mm-hmm.
So even if they want to have that experience, and again, I don't know if you have this in your group of friends, Kelly, but I know so many amazing women in their 30s and 40s, and they just can't meet somebody that they'd love to have a child with, but it just doesn't happen during that fertility window. And I've spoken to a few women in the last week who, again, really wanted to have a child, didn't meet their husbands till they were 39, 40, and then it just didn't happen for them. So there are all of these factors that we have to take into consideration. It's just not black and white. And
it's not.
Yeah,
it's not.
There's so many
and it's
factors.
So much. I mean, I think what you're speaking to there is the real life manifestation of what we deal with within the astrological community a lot, which is it's all about timing.
Yes.
You can be in the right place to have a child, but not with the right person or not with anyone. You can be in the wrong place to have a child, but be with a great partner. So, I mean, in some ways it is a massive miracle when it does come together, because so many other things have had to kind of align or fit in and dovetail to make it really flow.
So true. There's just so many different variables, and you could be feeling completely ready and open to that. But again, if you can't meet a suitable partner to have that experience with, or you're with somebody who doesn't want them, or you know, has already got children and doesn't want any more, then there's so much involved. This, you know, it's such a complex subject, really. And so it's so interesting. So basically, what I'm dying to hear your perspective on a lot of the astrological factors that can come into play. I know some people specialize, don't they, in like fertility astrology and working with the lunar cycle and all of this kind of thing. But I guess a lot of it is so dependent on your individual chart as well.
Hugely. And it is one of the areas that I have specialized in over the years, working with women who are wanting to conceive. And that, you know, you, from that perspective, you're working with them from all kinds of levels, like when's a good time for my husband and I to attempt conception, all the way up to, you know, artificial insemination or IVF procedures and timing and cycles on that front. But before you even get to that point, the birth chart itself can provide some clues as to the levels of fertility or viability around conception and childbearing for a person, regardless of timing, I guess.
So, Kelly, when you look at an individual's chart, can you see indications straight away of like, are there specific things that you see and you think, oh, okay, maybe they're not going to have children, or, oh, okay, there's some difficulty there in that area. So maybe that's going to, you know, they're going to need some extra help and support in conceiving. It's not going to be straightforward.
Yeah, 100%. The two most important things that I've found on the fertility side of things have to do with the moon and also the fifth house. And there's a few factors. With the moon, you look for the sign and the phase of the moon to start with, but also the aspects that the moon makes. And that really does set like a baseline for physical fertility and conception, I guess. And the fifth house will also give extra information. So the ruling planet of the sign on the fifth house, and depending on how strong or weak or what configurations it's involved in the chart. And
so obviously people can look at their chart for free at, I'm trying to remember now.
Astro.com.
That's right. So as long as they have to put in the time they were born, don't they, to get it very exact.
Yeah, so if you don't have the time that you're born, you can still do some work around the moon and the general indicators. If you do have the time, you can be a lot more specific. And once you've got the birth time, you'll get your houses set up and established, so then you can really hone in on the fifth house, which is part of the chart to do with children specifically.
And you've just reminded me, somebody I know who, she's also an astrologer, said to me a few years ago, she said, were you born near the new moon? So I said, I was actually. I was born within a couple of days of the new moon in Pisces. And she said, because I've got a theory that a lot of women who are born around the new moon may not necessarily go on and have children because they're here to create something else. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. She said, I really want to do more research on this. I'm not sure if she ever did, but you just reminded me of that conversation. So what are your thoughts about that? Do you think there's anything in that?
I do, because the moon, in modern astrology, we use 8 different phases of the moon, and the moon is the most important planet for everything to do with health. So health, vitality, a person's underlying constitution, it's all described through the moon in the birth chart. And the moon, through the phases, has more or less light. So a very simple rule of thumb is that the bigger or brighter the moon, the more vitality and, generally speaking, the more underlying fertility. There will probably be some qualifying factors, but that's sort of a general rule to get started. And so for women born in the new moon phase, I'm also born in the new moon phase, and women born in the balsamic or dark moon phase, these are the 2 dark moon phases. So even though the new moon has got the fresh energy of beginnings, the moon is still technically dark for a big chunk of that new moon phase. So that low light or lack of light of the moon around the balsamic moon and the new moon phase can be an inhibiting factor on the fertility front.
So that's really interesting. And also, I was reading something the other week and I thought I must ask Kelly this, where it said often if you've got moon in Pisces, that can be an influence as well. And I was just like, wow, because I've got sun, moon and Mercury in Pisces. So I was like, okay, so I've got the new moon thing and I've got my moon in Pisces. Like, do you think there's any truth in that?
I think that one not so much, because the moon, Pisces is one of our 3 fertile signs,
right?
And it is a sign traditionally ruled by Jupiter. So other than if you have the moon in Pisces and in the balsamic or the new moon phase, it's potentially going to be actually quite helpful for conception.
Right.
So, and that's where you are layering a few different pieces of astrological information together.
So interesting. I mean, that was based on somebody had actually, I think she'd done some research of about 300 women, and she was just looking at commonalities that came up, and that was one of them that she noticed that a high volume of these people had a Piscean moon. So I think that was what she was just looking at, some basic conclusions from that. So it's quite interesting. And so with the 5th house then, because it's not just about children, is it? It's also to do with obviously the creative energy.
Yeah.
So what would you say that when you look at that makes you think, okay, maybe they're not going to have children necessarily?
Sure. Yeah. The 5th house is to do with creativity. It's one of the romantic love sectors. It's got a bit to do with passion, sexual intimacy. It's also a bit of a risk-taking, have fun, playful sector. So it is certainly more than just children.
Yeah.
I think it's the combination of the 5th house being about the topic of children in conjunction with consideration of the moon, which has to do with the health and the physical body. And so you kind of weigh up the 2. And if both of them are very sort of abundant or lush or fertile, that's a really good indicator you're going to have someone who conceives easily, has multiple children, or really wants to have children. And then if the 5th house and the moon are both compromised, what you tend to find is people that aren't so interested in having kids at all, but when you take out the moon piece and you just look at the 5th house, you can still have someone who's incredibly creative or very artistic. Artistic talent can come from other parts of the chart. Placements to do with Venus or even Jupiter can be very creative inducing. So the creativity is perhaps a separate or a larger topic than just the 5th house, if that makes sense.
Okay, right. So that's interesting. And so if somebody was really looking to boost their fertility and they had a compromised 5th house, would you then look at other factors elsewhere to try and support that or give you indications of the best approach for that person?
Yeah, look, you can for sure. A lot of it depends on how old the person is,
Yeah.
and what they're looking for. Sorry, Michelle, did you mean on the fertility side or on the creative side of
Yeah,
things?
yeah, both really.
Yeah. Look, I think that the creativity is such a larger concept, and in some ways that involves helping people tap into whatever their talents might be.
Right.
Uh, so, separate to the fifth house or the moon, most people have one or two planets in their chart that stand out as being really strong or vibrant or functional. And those lucky charms or positive planets, if you like, can be like your trump card. So using them can really help people tap into creative energy or just a really personally positive flow.
Right. And so if you know that you can't have children or you're not going to, what can we look to then in our chart to give us some clues about how we can express ourselves in a way that's fulfilling, that brings purpose and meaning? So if we're looking at that, in another way, in another form, not through a physical child, what are
Yeah.
some of the other clues that we can look at in our chart to say, for example, you had always thought you were going to have children, you've been really focused on that, and now you're having to come to terms with the fact that's just not going to be possible for you. And so you're thinking, well, I don't really know what else is meaningful for me. So if that
Mm.
person was then thinking, all right, well, if I look at my astrological chart to give me some clues about what I might have an affinity with or be, potentially be good at, or something I could explore, what are some of the things that we should be looking for?
Sure, sure. I think if you were going to use the chart, you could look to, uh, again, it's going to sound weird, but I think the moon in the fifth house you could come back to, and probably the 11th house as well. So the moon, separate to its indications on fertility and mothering, is a planet about nurturing and self-care. So I think that's a planet for people to always be aware of, because it's sort of whatever the influences around your moon, even just knowing your moon sign as a starting point for people, that can help highlight things that just feel good or feel nourishing or feel safe for you.
And so for people who don't know a lot about that, the moon is often, it's connected to your emotional state, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, the moon represents your unconscious self, your kind of instinctive drivers.
Yeah.
So, separate to your star sign, which is more technically or correctly known as your sun sign, that the sun sign represents more of your personality or your externally expressed self, whereas the moon is more perhaps your private self, and it does talk about your feelings, and it really speaks to how you nourish or nurture yourself. So if you're listening and you don't yet know what your moon sign is, that would be a great starting point. If you know your moon sign, you might have a look at the house that the moon is placed in as an area of life that can be particularly nourishing or just feel really comfortable. And when we have that sort of feeling of being comfortable or safe, it strengthens us in a way that gives us courage and confidence to kind of do more in the world.
And especially if we're looking to expand our comfort zone and go into a new area, for example, to try and, look at what we find really fulfilling. So important what you say around making sure that we're nurturing ourselves and feeling safe.
Huge. Yeah. And then, I mean, the fifth house is the playful part of the chart. So if you have chosen not to have children or you wanted to have children and you weren't able to, the fifth house still shows you how you have fun. And so you want to make sure that you're doing things of a fifth house nature, even if you're not doing them with children. So you might do them with friends. I mean, for me personally, I have Cancer on the fifth house of my chart. So the sign of Cancer loves to kind of feed their loved ones. So I'm always baking for friends and family. And I got to the point where my stepson, who is just adorable, is not young. He's a young man, but he jokingly sort of refers to me that I'm trying to fatten them up because I'm always baking for them. So, but that's something I love, and it's a fifth house thing. And I'm sure I happen to cook for my stepkids, but I cook for just about everyone that I know. And so connecting to some of those hobbies, if you like, of the fifth house, which is one of our happy places in the
That's
chart.
my busiest house, actually, in my whole chart.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like when we have a lot of energy there. So that's interesting with Cancer, because that is the mothering sign, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So I do a lot of and it's very traditional style mothering. So it's sort of what I call my grandma's style of love, which is food is love. And what's going on with you, eat something kind of thing. Uh, you have Sagittarius, so connected to your fifth house. So, there's a lot of that travel and that wisdom and that spirituality. That's all very Sagittarius. So I think for you, Michelle, to use your chart as an example, yeah, it's very much about coming back to the search for truth and purpose and meaning.
Yeah.
And so for people to connect in to that fifth house in their own chart, can give them some clues as to their happy place or their happy experiences.
Absolutely. And so, interestingly, I was just considering with your personal situation, like you'd always had that awareness from a young age that maybe that was not going to be the path for you. You weren't going to necessarily experience that traditional mothering role in that way with your own biological children. And so I know that obviously you're married and you've got your stepchildren, but did you ever go through any type of grieving process at all, Kelly, or did you just always feel completely clear?
No.
So you've never had that?
No, I feel like I'm so the wrong person.
No, not at all. Everyone's different, but I was just being interesting because some people, even though they're like 100% crystal clear, that's not what they want. When they're, there and they're happily married and they're in like a long-term relationship, it's been interesting to say, like, occasionally they have had these waves of grief that have surprised them because, there's been that aspect of them, like, even if it's a very small part, that's gone, here I am with this beautiful man. I can imagine that it could also bring a lot of joy to have like a little being with this person who I really love and I know is the right partner for me. So even though they're like, I totally don't want this, so it's just interesting.
I do understand that. It's funny because when I met the man who's now my husband, I was like, oh, he's a man I could have had kids with.
Yeah.
Right? And it wasn't like a heart-wrenching thing. It was just like, you would have been a good person for me to have kids with had we met in different circumstances with different desires or what have we. If we were different people, I guess, in some ways. And I guess there is the one grieving, angsty piece that I did have to perhaps make peace with was the idea that because we won't have children together, which is a choice that really I made, and he was amazing about that, just because I didn't want to. So it wasn't really even like a big decision. I just wasn't that into it. I was a bit younger when we got together, so I said to him, I just need to reserve the right to change my mind as I get older, just in case, because everyone says to you when you get into your 30s, this magical clock will start ticking, but it never did for me.
Yeah.
But there was a little piece of me in the early stages of our relationship where I was like, he's shared something with another woman that I won't share with him.
Yes.
And it wasn't so much missing out on the child rearing per se. It was missing out on perhaps that element of intimacy, because I totally respect and understand that you form a connection with another person when you create a human that is not replicable you can't replicate that in different circumstances.
Absolutely. I totally get that. I feel the same like with my partner now. He's, I observe him with his children. He's an amazing dad.
Yeah.
And it's the first relationship that I've been in where I thought, if I was going to have a child, you would so have been the perfect person for me to have that experience with. But when I was married, for years I felt resistant to that. And the one time I was open to getting pregnant, I did. But it didn't feel real to me. And it was a molar pregnancy experience that I had. But it never ever felt right. And so it's really interesting. Like, when you have that time where you go, maybe if we'd met at another time, another place, we'd been slightly different, that would have happened, So it is interesting. And I agree with you. It's thinking that is a peak, very sacred experience that can't be
Mm-hmm.
replicated in any other way. So I totally, I totally understand that. I
For
completely,
sure.
yeah,
And the flip side of that is it's incredibly attractive to watch the man you love parent his children.
of course.
That, I mean, sure, you may not have been the one who created the children with him or your partner, but it is, you really see a different side of a person when you watch them go into that space.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and I mean, I used to say in my early 20s, I'm too selfish to have children. It's just that it's an all-encompassing kind of thing, and yeah.
But I think it's funny that you say that because, you see, interestingly, people that I know who've, and you included that have consciously chosen not to, it's something that they've given a great deal of thought to. I think it's just actually a very responsible decision. I think we need to kind of redefine selfish in a way, because most people
Yeah.
would have children because they want to. And so why is that not selfish? Like
100%, Michelle. Yeah, I think it's a very unfair term to call people who don't have children selfish. I think that's I don't even have words to respond.
Yeah, I mean,
it's such an unfair and inaccurate judgment call, because the person making that statement is coming purely from their own subjective reality, and sometimes it's the more responsible decision not to have children. And you're right, there are some people who make incredibly selfish choices to have children, and I think that sometimes maybe needs a little bit of attention.
A lot of attention. Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, I was talking to a couple I know recently, and like you, they're both from big families. And so they both knew from being very young that they didn't want to have children, because I guess they always experienced that they were competing all the time for their parents' attention, because there were, a large number of them. And so it was just something that they felt they didn't want to experience. They felt they never had any time to themselves, any privacy. So, of course, I guess often the things that we experience when we're a child, we often want to experience what we see as being completely the opposite of that. Often we're drawn to what we didn't experience as a child just because it's different.
For sure. And they're very valid considerations. I know for me personally, I loved growing up in a large family.
Yeah.
I think that my siblings are some of the greatest gifts and boons in my life.
Yeah.
And I owe a huge gratitude to my parents for raising such a large family. And as we become adults, you've got this inbuilt network of people. And look, we're totally crazy. We're all loud and partly Lebanese, and we don't all get along, and we're all very strong personalities. But we're kind of forged together, and we've got this bond. But I also know how hard it was for my parents to do the work of raising such a large family. And that was one piece that I remember being aware of from maybe a younger age than most people, was that being a parent or raising a family is a massive undertaking. And so I think for myself, I was very aware of what would be involved in a decision like that, and maybe just wasn't that keen on it. Basically.
Yeah, you were very aware of the reality that's involved.
It's hard work.
Yeah,
it's really
very
hard work.
You need to be really committed, don't you? It's very hard, very challenging.
Well, and my husband, we had lots of conversations, about kids and families and things. And even he, having had his own children who he loves and adores, he's also very aware that, like you were saying before, that some people have children maybe for not the right reasons. And that can create a whole host of other sort of scenarios that are equally challenging, I guess.
Yeah. And so, obviously, having a child, it's the traditional way of, expressing yourself creatively. So, what are some of the ways that you express yourself creatively?
Well, I was trying to think about that, and I sort of thought, well, I feel like my whole life is creative.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the most traditionally creative thing that I do is a large portion of my work is writing.
Yeah.
So I write all kinds of things from feature articles in magazines to horoscope columns to ebooks. I'm writing on my blog. I mean, I'm just writing all the time. So that's what I do. And I think for me, my babies are the books and the writing projects that I do, I guess.
Yeah.
But certainly, my life work, my devotion to astrology is incredibly creative because it's hugely stimulating and awe-inspiring and heart-opening and incredibly fulfilling. So to me, that's all a part of a creative experience, I guess.
Yeah, of course. And so what do you feel, Kelly, are the major benefits of not having children?
Oh, wow. Well, and this, I mean, obviously it's totally biased opinion because I don't know what the other side is. And, I see my little nephew that my brother and his partner are just delighting in, and he is a joy, that's for sure. But I think that's part of the joy of, a benefit of not having children is that I can still delight in children, and I love especially babies. I mean, I'm the woman that if you're carrying a baby around me and we don't know each other, doesn't matter, I'm about to meet you. I've learned you're not supposed to touch them and all of that, but I'll be very excited to catch up with people who are having babies. So the benefits of not having children, I guess it's a little bit of time. It's freedom to do with both time and money. That your choices are a little bit more your own. I'm kind of in a half, 1 foot in, 1 foot out situation because my partner does have children and they're not adults yet. So we are still, housing them and supporting them and doing a lot of the parenting steps with them. Yeah. But even within that, there is it's different even when the kids are sort of shared between two households, if you like, that the load of raising them, both in terms of time, money, and support, there is more for the child, but there's also more hands to many hands make light work, I guess. So, look, a very long-winded way of saying it's freedom to do with time, money, and really life choices.
Yes, absolutely.
Where do we want to go traveling, or where do we want to, how do we want to set the house up, or what have you? You get a little bit more of
flexibility.
More flexibility, that's the word.
Yes, you can tell I'm used to having teenagers here half the time as well.
Yeah, of course. Okay, good. Your partner's kids live with you guys sometimes as well?
Yeah. So they're back and forth. So nearly half the time. So it's interesting.
Yeah, we had a half-time schedule as well while the kids were going through school. So
yes, So
you're doing everything. Essentially, there's lunches, and did you get out the door to the bus, and who's got sports practice or music or what have you?
Yes, all of those joyful activities.
Yes, and teenagers, I mean, they're entertaining and interesting.
Well, yes, that's a very polite way of putting it, I think. Kelly, where's the best place to find you online if anybody would like to explore their chart with you and find out more about your work?
Oh, absolutely. The best place would be my website, which is kellysastrology.com. So Kelly's Astrology. Or you can find me on Facebook, Kelly's Astrology there, or maybe I'm Kelly Surtees Astrology. Can't remember. Anyway, you'll easily find me. I'm also on Twitter, and I've just joined Instagram, so I'm trying to get across all these social networks. I do have my blog on my website there, which I update every couple of days, so you can always find out what's happening astrologically. And on the website there, you'll have the chart consults section. So if you're looking to do an astrology reading, if you want to find out more about what astrology has to say about you or your chart or your life, that's where you'll go to find out how to book in. And if you've got any questions, you can also just email me directly, kelly@kellysastrology.com.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much. So interesting to talk to you. And love hearing your perspective on all of that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It was a real honor to be able to come and talk with you today. And I look forward to doing it again in the future.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Unclassified Woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. For information on events and services, connect with Michelle at michellemariemcgrath.com.